Welcome, and thank you for joining me on this quiet journey into a time long before the Romans, long before the Greeks, long before the names we usually remember. Tonight, we're going back further, to the highlands of ancient Anatolia, where stone lions still guard silent gates, and the wind carries whispers from a people long thought lost. We are going to the world of the Hittites. You may not know their names. Most people don't. For centuries, even historians believed they had never existed at all. No temples remained, no marble statues, no famous poems, just clay, baked by time, buried by earth, waiting in silence. And yet, they were once powerful. They spoke to pharaohs, challenged empires, and held the mountains with treaties, not just swords. Tonight, we will not march in haste. There will be no grand speeches, no crashing chariots. Instead, we'll follow a scribe through the halls of Hattusa, trace the finger marks left in wet clay, and feel the hush of a stone temple as twilight falls. We'll meet kings who called themselves my son, queens who ruled beside them, farmers who watched the storm clouds with equal parts reverence and fear. And when the empire falls, as all empires do, we won't rush to explain it. We'll just sit with the silence that followed, because sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones almost forgotten. So now, let the lights dim, let your breath soften, let the sound of ancient footsteps guide you. We're going back to a kingdom carved in stone, spoken in syllables long lost, and remembered only recently. This is the story of the Hittites. Life in the Hittite Empire, 2000 BC. In today's episode, we are going to go back in time to 2000 BC and find out what life was like in the Hittite Empire, because it gives us an unprecedented glimpse into the lives of Anatolian people. At the dawn of the late Bronze Age, you find yourself standing in front of a humble mud brick house, your new home for the next 24 hours in the bustling city of Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire. You are about to experience a day in the life of a commoner during the peak of the empire, around 1300 BC. As one of history's first great empires, it flourished in what is now Turkey between 1600 and 1178 BC. After resting a bit, it's time to take on a new task. The Hittite Empire is vast and its borders are constantly under threat from invaders. You are dirty and exhausted, but there is still more work to be done. In the evening, you help your father repair his tools and prepare them for the next day's work. You mend a broken plow and sharpen a hoe. The work is painstaking, but it must be done. There were a few who enjoyed unimaginable luxury and power, including the kings of the Hittite Empire. Imagine being one of these rulers and having the responsibility and privilege of leading the empire into a new era of prosperity and glory. Without sharp tools, your family would struggle to plant crops and survive. You knew that the empire was constantly threatened by rival kingdoms, and you took steps to ensure that the Hittite army was well trained and equipped. You met with your generals to discuss military strategy and make sure that the army was ready to defend the empire from any potential threats. You took pride in being a leader of the Hittite Empire, and were committed to doing everything in your power to ensure its prosperity and glory. The newly crowned king of the Hittite Empire. While the elite enjoyed luxury and power, most of the empire's inhabitants, including farmers, artisans, and merchants, lived simple and often difficult lives. Are eager to start your day. They dealt in a variety of products, including textiles, metalwork, and luxury items such as ivory and precious stones. Their work was dangerous and unpredictable, and they faced the risk of robbery and the uncertainty of international trade. You rise early and make your way to the royal bathhouse, where attendants have already drawn a warm bath for you. As you relax in the warm water, they faced the constant threat of crop failure due to the dry and rocky terrain and unpredictable weather patterns. Blacksmiths, potters, and weavers created goods that were essential for everyday life and trade. They developed innovative farming techniques to deal with the dry terrain, and they created a vibrant trade network that connected them to other civilizations. They also developed a sophisticated legal code that protected the rights of individuals and ensured justice. They worked in small workshops or from their homes, and their products ranged from simple tools to elaborate works of art. The Hittite Empire may have been lost to the sands of time, but its legacy lives on in the stories of its people. We hope you enjoyed this journey back in time, and encourage you to keep exploring the fascinating world of ancient history. Their days were filled with planting, harvesting, and tending to their fields, and they often worked from sunrise to sunset. You think about the challenges and responsibilities that await you. The Hittites were known for their skilled iron workers who produced some of the finest weapons in the ancient world, including a golden crown that has been passed down from your ancestors. You know that your authority comes from the gods themselves, but you also understand that to maintain the empire's prosperity, you must be fair and just in your rule. You also had to attend to the social aspects of your role. You hosted lavish parties and banquets in your honor and those of your guests. You danced with beautiful women and drank fine wine while listening to the sweet sounds of musicians playing traditional Hittite songs. You listen to the pleas of your people and make decisions that you believe are in the best interest of the empire. You take your place on a golden throne and meet with your advisors to discuss the affairs of the empire. The Hittite Empire was vast and complex, and it required a team of skilled advisors to help you make decisions that would affect the entire empire. You listened intently as they discussed matters such as trade, agriculture, and diplomacy, and so you cherish this time with your loved ones. You listen to your elders recount tales of the empire's glory and the great battles that have been fought and won. The Hittites were a warrior culture, and their victories were celebrated throughout the empire. You dream of becoming a great warrior yourself one day. The weapons would be used by the elite soldiers who defended the empire from its enemies. You have been assigned to help build a new temple to one of the Hittite gods, working alongside other men in your community. You carry mud bricks to the construction site. The temple is a massive structure made of huge stones and decorated with intricate carvings. The Hittite Empire is vast and powerful, but it is also dangerous. Bandits and invaders roam the countryside, and you are just a small, insignificant person in this world. You try to push the thoughts out of your mind and focus on your family, but as you lie down to sleep, you can't help but wonder what the future holds for you and your family. Will you be able to continue working the land and providing food for the empire? Or will you be called to fight in one of the Hittites' many wars? Only time will tell. You are just a small part of this grand project, and your work is tedious and dangerous. But you take pride in knowing that you are helping to create a lasting legacy for the empire. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Dirt floor, rough woven mats, and simple clay furniture adorn the small room, while the smell of yesterday's goat hangs heavy in the air. Your stomach growls, reminding you that breakfast is long overdue. You head to the central courtyard where your family has already begun their morning ritual. A small fire has been lit in the hearth and some grain has been ground into flour. Using a mortar and pestle, your mother prepares a simple porridge, which you eat with your father and siblings. The porridge tastes bland and unappetizing, and you can't help but wonder if this is the norm or if you have just been assigned to a poor family. Prepare to be transported back in time to the year 2000 BC. You wake up early, eager to start the day, but your enthusiasm quickly fades when you realize you have no idea where you are or how you got there. And that's when you remember you have just time traveled back to the Hittite Empire. The Hittite Empire is a captivating subject as the first rays of sunlight peek over the horizon. Daily life immersion. You push open the door and step inside to be greeted by a scene straight out of the past. As a young man, you are expected to help your father in his field as an agricultural worker. You grab your tools and join him in the fields outside the city walls. The work is hard and the soil is rocky and dry, but you know that the success of your family depends on the harvest to come. You spend the entire morning and afternoon planting wheat, barley, and vegetables. The sun beats down on you and sweat trickles down your face and neck. By the time you finish your work, you are exhausted and dirty. After breakfast, it's time to get to work. You return home and are relieved to find that your mother has prepared a simple lunch of bread and cheese for you. Throughout the day, you hear the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer as he works on new weapons for the soldiers. As the sun begins its slow descent, you and the other workers head back to your homes. As darkness falls, you sit around a small fire with your family and share stories and jokes. There is little else to do in the evenings, but as the night wears on, you begin to feel uneasy. A day in the life of a king. While most of the empire's inhabitants lived and died in obscurity, it's a bright and sunny morning, and you, after bathing, you put on fine linen clothes and don your royal jewelry. As a devout follower of the storm god, Teshub, one of the most important aspects of being a Hittite king was maintaining a strong military. But being a king was not all about work and duty. Despite the challenges and responsibilities of being a king, you wouldn't trade your position for anything. Daily life beneath the palaces. Beneath the splendor of the Hittite palaces, life for ordinary citizens was a mix of hard work and daily struggles. Farmers made up the majority of the population and worked long and hard to cultivate the land and raise livestock. Artisans played a vital role in the Hittite economy. Merchants traveled throughout the empire and beyond, bringing goods to distant markets. Life in the Hittite Empire was not easy, but its people were resilient and adaptable. As we reflect on the lives of the Hittites, we are reminded of the diversity and complexity of human history. This is the Hittite Empire. Hello and welcome to this channel, where we try and answer the great geographic what-if questions of the world. The Hittite Empire existed in modern-day Turkey during the Late Bronze Age between around 1600 BC and 1178 BC, which puts them contemporaries with the Egyptians. Instead, their neighbors were almost exclusively non-Indo-European peoples such as the Kaska to the south, the Mitanni to the east, and the Lucca to the west, setting the stage for his son, Mursili I, to conquer all of Anatolia north of the river Sagan. Mursili is famous for leading the Hittites to victory at the Battle of Kadesh against the Egyptians in 1274 BC. But that battle is also pretty infamous for being a total mess. Now a supporter of traditional Hittite religion, one of his first acts was revenge against the city of Korana, which had rebelled against his authority. After sacking the city, which was located near the modern Turkish city of Antalya on the Mediterranean coast, scholars have long debated whether the Hittites had their own navy round of what if. What if the Hittite Empire had survived? We already know that the Hittites had extensive trade networks throughout the ancient Near East. They traded regularly with Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and even as far away as Greece. What if the Hittites used their extensive trade network to unite the Levant, Anatolia, and the Aegean into a single cultural sphere? Would the Greeks adopt the Hittite writing system and become a literate society? Hundreds of years earlier, would the Phoenicians have been able to build their own empire without the help of the Assyrians? Would the Israelites still have left the region altogether? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, or if they simply hired ships from the Lucca to transport goods across the sea. Religion and culture continued to influence the region long after their political power had faded away. Their empire set the foundation for later Anatolian states such as the Kingdom of Kaya and the Kingdom of Armenia, as well as the Neo-Hittite states of the Late Iron Age. However, an inscription on a rock monolith seems to indicate that the Hittites did indeed have a navy, which they used to blockade Lucca cities along the coast and demand their submission. He traveled there to pray to the gods of the Hittites and received an ecstatic vision which inspired him to launch the biggest building project in Hittite history, the construction of a new capital. Basically, the two sides met in the middle and things got really confusing from there. A place of peace and prosperity. And so he set about to creating this ideal city. The empire enjoyed a golden age under Hattusili's reign. Trade flourished and the empire experienced a renaissance in art and architecture. Unfortunately, this prosperity would not last for long. The empire began to experience greater and greater instability in the decades following Hattusili's death, eventually succumbing to pressure from the Sea Peoples and other invaders in 1178 BC. The location he chose was here at the site of modern-day Boghazköy, and here he constructed the great city of Yilmaz Tepe, complete with palaces, temples, citadels, gardens, stables, and houses for his people. Some scholars argue that these stories are just myths, but the archaeological evidence points to the existence of at least some sort of grand building program during Hatshepsut's reign. Either way, it would become the new Hittite capital. According to the Egyptians, the Hittite charioteers fled in terror when Ramesses II unleashed his elite troops. But according to the Hittites, it was Ramesses who panicked and fled after seeing their god, the storm god Tarhunt, appear on Earth in the form of a shining warrior. In reality, the battle probably ended in a stalemate after both sides suffered heavy losses. But either way, the result was a peace treaty between the Hittites and the Egyptians, establishing good relations between the two empires, and ending any hope of an Egyptian invasion of Anatolia. And while the Hittites were not an ethnically homogeneous empire, but his grandson, Suppiluliuma I, was able to reunite the empire and establish the Neo-Hittite period, which would last until the collapse of the empire in the early 9th century. Suppiluliuma I is known for his many building projects throughout his empire, including the new palace at Hattusa. He also reformed the Hittite army, replacing horses with chariots for more mobility. But it was his son, Arnuanda II, who would put the Hittite Empire on the path to greatness. They were culturally more similar to the Luwian-speaking peoples to the south than anyone else, conquering the old Assyrian city of Korana and forcing the Assyrians to pay tribute to the Hittite Empire. Under his successor, Mursili II, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching all the way to the Persian Gulf. Unfortunately, the empire would begin to decline under Mursili's successors, starting with Muwatalli II, who broke away from the traditional Hittite religion, adopting the Syrian sun god as his chief deity. This caused unrest throughout the empire, especially at the hands of priests who kept the traditional religion alive, and this culminated in the accession of Hattusa III, who was forced to flee to Egypt as a young prince due to the religious strife. So we'll classify them as an Indo-European empire for the purposes of this video. Mycenaeans and the very first Israelites. Their empire covered much of the Anatolian peninsula and parts of the Armenian highlands, making their empire mostly contained within modern-day Turkey with small parts extending into Syria and northern Iraq. The Hittite capital was at the city of Hattusa, which sits just north of the modern Turkish city of Boğazkale. It's here that we can see the geography of the Hittite heartland, a mix of rugged mountains and open plains, which will be important for the development of the Hittites as a people later on. Today we're looking at the mighty Hittites and answering the question, what if Anatolia had its own Egyptian empire? Before we get into it, let's take a look at our map. The Hittite language itself was an Indo-European language related to the Vedic and Iranian branches, but they never expanded into India or Persia. But how did they come to power? Well, according to Hittite legend, they got their start in the Armenian highlands in the kingdom of Hattusa. Here we have the earliest records of the name Hittite or Hitti, a small local kingdom ruled over by a king named Telepinu. His son was Labarnai, and under his rule, the Hittites expanded out of the highlands and into Kasgaland. Now, don't confuse this Labarna with the Egyptian pharaoh who took that name later on. This guy isn't even technically a pharaoh, but rather the chief of a small tribe. Nevertheless, he's pretty notable because the entire Hittite empire would eventually trace its lineage back to him. Labyrinth continued to expand Hittite influence into central Anatolia. After Mursili's death, his empire was briefly broken up between his sons. Arnuandatu defeated the Mitanni and Kaska to the east and launched an invasion of Mesopotamia. Hattusa III spent 5 years in Egypt learning their culture before returning home and reconquering the Hittite throne. Now the story goes that Hattusa dreamt of a great city nestled between two rivers, with flowering plants and trees laden with fruit. In fact, Hatshepsut may have even been responsible for the establishment of a seaport at the city of Elalish, despite the vast amount of time and resources devoted to building programs. And now we have a quick fire. As for the real world, the Hittite Empire would leave behind a legacy that lasted for centuries. While their language died out in Anatolia, their art. We've been talking about the Hittite Empire for several episodes now, and it is finally time to go to Anatolia and check out their biggest city. But first, just a quick reminder. I highly recommend that you go watch our previous episode on the Hittites, where I talk more in depth about their origins and rise to power. But suffice it to say here that the Hittites were a mysterious Indo-European people who showed up in Anatolia around the 20th century BC and quickly rose to become the dominant power in the region. You might not have heard of it, but trust me, you'll find yourself in the city center where you can check out the sprawling citadel walls that surround the royal palace, temples, and other important buildings. It is pretty clear that the Hittites were a proud people who loved to show off their wealth and power. But if you're more interested in the finer things in life, then you'll definitely want to take a detour to the Temple of the Storm God. This temple is dedicated to the Hittite deity Teshub. Here you'll get the chance to see all sorts of goods from neighboring lands. You'll want to head over to the Citadel Hill to watch the sunset. This massive hill was the beating heart of the city, and it provided stunning views of the surrounding countryside. As you watch the sun go down, may the spirit of exploration and adventure guide you in all that you do, and may the memory of this ancient city inspire you to uncover the hidden wonders of our world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop seeking out the extraordinary in the everyday. Who knows what treasures of history await us just around the corner? So go forth, adventurers, and may your journeys be filled with the magic and mystery of the past. You'll feel a sense of peace and tranquility wash over you, and you'll realize that this is more than just a visit to an ancient city. This is a journey back in time to a world that was both familiar and strange. A world where gods walked among men and chariots raced through the streets. A world where the treasures of Babylon were on display and the secrets of the universe were whispered in the wind, including textiles from Syria, but whose legacy lives on in the stones and legends of old. Hatshepsut, thank you for showing us the wonders of the Hittite Empire. We may be leaving now, but we'll never forget what we've seen here. The majestic Lion Gate, the serene temple of the Storm God, the awe-inspiring treasury of the Storm God, the organized royal library, the lively marketplace, and the breathtaking views from Citadel Hill. You have shown us the splendor and sophistication of the Hittite civilization, and we are forever changed by what we have witnessed. Ivory from Egypt and tin from the mountains of Anatolia. But before we go, I want you to know that this is not the end. The story of the Hittites is one that continues to unfold. Every new discovery, every unearthed artifact, every deciphered tablet brings us closer to understanding these enigmatic people and their enduring legacy. You might even be able to pick up a souvenir or two to remember your trip by, although I wouldn't recommend trying to haggle over the price. The merchants here are notoriously tough negotiators, and they won't let you get away with a lowball offer. Who was often depicted as a bull, and the intricate carvings on the walls are seriously breathtaking. If you're an art lover, you could spend hours just marveling at the detail and craftsmanship. You're gonna want to stick around because this place is seriously impressive. That's why we're going to finish off our tour with a visit to the treasury of the storm god. Here you'll get the chance to see some of the treasures that were looted from the sack of Babylon. And let me tell you, the Babylonians weren't messing around when it came to bling. From golden chariots to piles of precious metals, you'll feel like you've just stumbled onto the set of a fantasy movie. We'll start off with a nice stroll through the city's impressive gates. These massive stone creatures are not just impressive to look at. They also served as a way to keep the treasure safe from thieves. After all, who would want to mess with a bunch of angry bulls with wings, which are decorated with everything from lions to sphinxes? This was one of the largest libraries in the ancient world, and it contained thousands of clay tablets that were inscribed with everything from religious texts to business records. The library was also one of the first places in the world to use a card catalog system, which may sound surprising, but the Hittites were really ahead of their time when it came to organization. These majestic stone creatures are not just for looks though, they also served as a warning to any would-be invaders. Just try getting past the gate when it's guarded by a couple of angry lions. They ruled over a vast empire that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf, and they were known for their skill in chariot warfare and their use of iron weapons. But despite their military prowess, the Hittites were also a highly civilized people who developed many of the trappings of urban life, including impressive public buildings, advanced plumbing systems, and even a written language. In fact, the Hittite language is still studied by scholars today, and it has helped us to unlock many of the secrets of their civilization. Welcome back to Quickie, everyone. But eventually the people began to mysteriously disappear from Anatolia, and today we still don't know exactly what happened to them. However, we do know that they left behind an incredible legacy of art, architecture, and culture, and in this episode, we will explore some of the most fascinating aspects of Hittite civilization. I know it's been a while since we did one of these, so get your passport stamped and bring your archaeologist's license, because we are about to travel back in time to one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. But it was worth the wait because today we are going to be taking a deep dive into one of my favorite civilizations in all of history, the Hittites. Now if you haven't already done so, the Hittite Empire lasted for several centuries, and the best place to start our exploration is the city of Hattusa. Welcome to Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire. Once you make it through the gates, but let's be real, you didn't come to Hatshepsut to look at pictures, did you? No, you want to see the real thing. And hey, while you're there, don't forget to check out the human-headed winged bulls that guard the entrance to the treasury. If you're looking for something a little less intimidating, then you can always head over to the Royal Library. Of course, no visit to the city would be complete without a trip to the bustling marketplace. Finally, as the sun begins to set over the horizon, it's a world that may be gone. So now it's time to say goodbye as you step back into your own time. I hope you carry a piece of Hattusa in your heart. Fertile farmlands, towering mountains, inland rivers, plenty of gold, silver, and iron. What more could you want? This is Anatolia, now Turkey, in the late Bronze Age. It's a place of plenty, and one kingdom rules all. Did you know that according to legend, the Hittites built their capital at the exact center of the world? Okay, maybe not so fun, but it's true. Every official document was written on a clay tablet and stamped with the king's seal. Records about taxes, building projects, treaties, even complaints from subjects were all written down. That's right, even complaints. Now it's time to get a little more specific. The ruling elite also changed, and eventually the Hittites were gone. But their empire left a lasting legacy on the region. The Hittites were one of the first civilizations in the ancient world to have a strong centralized government. They also developed new ways of farming and new technologies that helped them win battles. But perhaps their greatest legacy is the way they organized their society. The Hittite Empire was one of the first in the ancient world to have a ruling elite that was based on merit rather than bloodlines. This allowed talented people from all walks of life to rise to the top and make important contributions to the empire. Let's talk about two of the most important positions in Hittite society, the king and the vizier. Let us know in the comments section below. We hope you enjoyed learning about the Hittites with us. If you did, please remember to give us a thumbs up and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Elite Life is made possible by our generous patrons. If you would like to see your name at the end of every episode, then you too can support us. As we mentioned earlier, the king was at the top of the pyramid. He was considered a god on earth, and everyone below him had to do what he said. The king's power was inherited, meaning that the son became king after his father died. The king's wife could also be really powerful, though she ran the household and took care of the royal children. She could also act as a regent if the king went to war or had to leave the kingdom for some other reason. The vizier, on the other hand, was a position that was earned through merit. Viziers were usually really smart and well educated, and they served as the king's right-hand man. They were in charge of making sure that the empire ran smoothly and that everyone followed the king's laws. Viziers were often given really important jobs, like leading an army or collecting taxes. The king wanted to hear about everything that was happening in his lands, both good and bad, so that he could address it. There were even record keepers whose job it was to watch over other record keepers to make sure they weren't lying or cheating. Hattusa was founded as the exact center of the known world, which included Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant. Soldiers, priests, and officials all worked together to make the empire run smoothly. Soldiers were very important because without an army, there was no way the Hittites could hold on to their lands or protect themselves from invaders. Many soldiers were charioteers because chariots were the main form of transportation in warfare. Chariots were expensive and required a lot of horses to pull them, so only the elite could afford to own one. The Hittite army was impressive and probably looked like this, charging into battle with swords and spears raised high. Priests were also important because religion was central to Hittite life. The Hittites believed that the gods were interested in human affairs, so they built large temples where they could worship. Some priests were in charge of taking care of the temple, while others acted as intermediaries between the people and the gods. Officials were essential to running the empire because the Hittite king didn't do everything himself. He appointed officials to oversee everything from farming to trade to construction. Without these people, the empire would grind to a halt. According to the Hittite king's divine mandate, this made him the center of everything. The typical Hittite house was made of mud brick and had a courtyard in the middle. This is pretty similar to houses in the Middle East today. The courtyard was used for everything from eating meals to receiving guests. The house would also have had servants living in it, such as slaves or lower members of society, who would take care of the home. Now, obviously, the bigger your house, the higher up you are in society. For example, a palace would look more like a giant mansion with lots of courtyards and rooms, while a regular house would be much smaller. And to ensure this, he had to keep everyone else in check. So while the Hittite king sat at the center of the world, he kept an eye on his neighbors. In fact, there were many rivals nearby, including the Kaska people to the east, the Sea peoples in the south along the Mediterranean, and the Egyptian Empire to the southwest, who also claimed to be the center of everything. And then there were the Assyrians to the north and northeast, the Mitanni to the east, and the Ahiyawa, aka the Achaeans or Mycenaeans, to the west. And while the Hittite Empire was at its height, all these groups were challenging and fighting against them. The Hittites. In case of war, your palace wasn't easy to get to. The city of Hattusa, with its impressive citadel, took up 17 hectares, and its outer wall alone was 8 meters high and 3 meters wide. And when it was finished, the royal palace was the best defense of all. It was the most magnificent building in the city. From the outside, it looked imposing, but on the inside, it was all about luxury and power. Many rooms were decorated with battle scenes showing the king defeating his enemies, solidifying his power. These scenes may have been painted by professional artists or even slaves taken from conquered territories. In fact, slavery was common among the Hittite elite. Some slaves were prisoners of war, and some were owned by the royal family itself. Some slaves worked in the fields, but others helped run the massive palace bureaucracy. They built their empire here around 1600 BCE, and they would last for centuries. But how did the Hittites become so powerful, and what kind of society did they build? Welcome to Elite Life. Today we're going inside the Hittite elite. If you like the series so far, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up to support our work. Before we get into the palaces and politics of the Hittite kings, let's start with something fun. But if you were the king, you were pretty well protected. Speaking of bureaucracy, there were lots of scribes working for the king, too, since the Hittites loved to make records. Now, while the king and his palace were important, the Hittite Empire couldn't function without the rest of the elite, and all these elites lived in fancy houses. So far, we've talked about the basics of Hittite society. The Hittite Empire lasted for centuries, and during that time, it changed a lot. Now it's your turn. What did you think of the Hittite Empire? Were they impressive or did you find them boring? The biggest empire you've never heard about is not an empire of soldiers or generals or kings. It was an empire of paper pushers, record keepers, scribes who held it together with their pens. Welcome to the Hittite Empire. Usually an empire needs three things: land, people, and resources. And usually these are acquired through conquest and subjugation. But for the Hittites, they had none of those things. They were a small group of Indo-European nomads that migrated to Anatolia in the late Bronze Age. They settled in what is today central Turkey and established their empire around 1600 BC. He would bring a whole team of scribes with him to record the events of the war, often having them ride along with him in a chariot. Upon returning home, they would publish a detailed account of the battle for the king, including casualty numbers and even descriptions of the terrain. These scribes were considered vital to the military effort, so much so that one scribe was even appointed to the position of general. The origins of the treaty go back to the 13th century BC, when the Hittites and the Egyptians were bitter enemies, which allowed both sides to feel like they had made their mark. While treaties between equals were rare in the ancient world, the Hittites also used their record-keeping to study the stars. In fact, it was common for scribes to begin the record of a king's reign with an omen, which was often based on astronomical observations. This practice ensured that each ruler's term in office was seen as divinely ordained. The Hittite king's court included an astronomer whose job was to keep track of the movements of the planets and stars. He would make regular reports to the king, including daily updates on the positions of the constellations. But they couldn't just hand the Hittites over to the Egyptians without knowing who they were dealing with. You see, after the Egyptians and Assyrians won the war, they found themselves with a problem. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and this was certainly one of those. Prisoners of war were taken to centers of learning where they were forced to teach the Egyptians and Assyrians their language, their creation of the first accounting system, their standardization of weights and measures. Check out my series on the deadliest jobs of the ancient world. Thank you so much for watching. And their ability to communicate across cultures helped create the conditions for trade and diplomacy to flourish. And without them, it's hard to imagine that the ancient world would have been the same. Then these newly minted bilinguals were sent to the front lines, where they could negotiate with the Hittite soldiers and officers. Neither of them spoke Hittite, but they had just spent years fighting against an army that did, and now they needed a way to communicate with them. Appointed to the staff of the Egyptian pharaoh and served as an interpreter for the rest of his life. Ultimately, the Hittite language died out, but it left behind a legacy that would help shape the ancient Near East. So they tasked one of the scribes with figuring it out. He did what any good field linguist would do, and had the scribe translate a number of simple phrases into Hittite, such as "where is the bathroom?" and "how much does this thing cost?" Once they had a basic understanding of the language, they were able to determine that the kingdom that was asking for help was indeed loyal to the Hittites. This information was critical to the king because the Hittites believed that the gods communicated with them through the stars, but the Egyptians couldn't read Hittite, and the Egyptians and the Hittites used completely different writing systems. So how could they share intelligence? Enter the scribes. A scribe from Arzawa traveled to Egypt bearing gifts for the pharaoh, and a letter from his king asking for support. So it was important to know what the heavens had to say. The Egyptians and the Hittites didn't just stop at a peace treaty. They followed it up with a mutual defense alliance against outside invaders. Internal strife weakened them, and outside invaders took advantage of their vulnerability. By the 12th century BC, the empire was gone and their language fell out of use. But before that, their scribes made one last contribution to the world, and even outlined the terms of succession so that neither side would have a justification for going to war. After decades of fighting over control of Syria, the two decided to meet in the middle and settle their differences. The resulting peace treaty between the two empires is considered by many scholars to be the first of its kind. No written records exist of this general actually commanding any troops. but his job was likely to oversee the record-keeping of the military. Yet despite their relatively small size, they would go on to conquer much of the ancient Near East, clashing with Egypt, the Mitanni Empire, and Assyria. As the old power crumbled, various groups scrambled to fill the void. One of those groups was the Kingdom of Arzawa, located in western Anatolia. Their king wanted to take advantage of the situation and carve out an independent state free from Hittite influence. Hittite scribes also helped produce the goods that made the Hittite economy possible. Much of their wealth came from trade with neighboring city-states and kingdoms, and to keep the goods moving, they needed a way to standardize weights and measures. To that end, scribes created a series of standardized seals and stamps that were used throughout the empire to ensure that merchants were being charged fairly. To understand what made this empire different, we have to start by talking about how empires usually work, which were small clay balls that were stamped with one of these official seals. They would be attached to a piece of string or a cord and then looped through the mouth of a sack or chest to serve as a seal. If the ball was unbroken, it meant that the contents had not been tampered with. In fact, some historians argue that the use of these bulli may have contributed to the development of the alphabet, because merchants would want a quick way to break the seal without damaging it, so that they could inspect the goods inside and reseal it before moving on. So if they weren't big, powerful, or numerous, how did they do it? Please hit that subscribe button to get more content like this, often leaving them in the hands of members of the royal family or nobility. There was no professional class of scribes in the Hittite Empire like there was in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Instead, literacy was spread among the elite, and scribes were often given to local officials as a sort of personal secretary. This meant that each governor or administrator would have someone to keep track of their affairs. While they went out hunting or to war, these administrators would collect taxes and tribute from the subjects and maintain law and order. And to keep track of everything, they employed scribes who kept detailed written records of all activities, essentially creating the first accounting system in history. Well, unlike other empires of their time, the Hittites didn't have huge standing armies or conscript soldiers during wartime. So instead of conquering new lands through military might, they conquered them through diplomacy and trade. And to facilitate all of these diplomatic and commercial relations, they needed a well-organized bureaucracy, which meant lots of record keeping. In fact, their entire empire was held together with an unprecedented amount of paperwork. Throughout their empire, they would set up local officials to manage cities and provinces. But because the Hittite Empire was so decentralized, these scribes were a critical component in holding it all together. In fact, when the king went to battle, in addition to recording important events, they also created a system of bulli. And speaking of moving on, if you're enjoying this episode, perhaps the most famous scribes in the Hittite Empire were the ones who helped create the first treaty in recorded history. It was written into versions, one in hieroglyphic Egyptian and another in Hittite cuneiform. In addition to outlining legal and economic policies, these astronomers also worked closely with the scribes who were responsible for recording the reigns of the kings. Like many empires, the Hittite Empire eventually collapsed. During the collapse of the empire, much of the Near East was thrown into chaos. To do this, he needed help from the Hittites' former allies, the Egyptians. The Egyptians, eager to expand their influence in the region, agreed to help the kingdom, and so the Egyptians and the Assyrians were able to form an alliance to defeat them. But that wasn't the end of the story. Instead of starting from scratch, they turned to the very thing that had kept the Hittite Empire together: the scribes. In fact, one Hittite prisoner of war became so successful at translating that he was. In fact, the Hittite scribes played a pivotal role in shaping the course of history. And if you want to learn more about the scribes of the ancient world, Hittite Empire, in today's episode, we are going to look at the forgotten empire that predated Egypt by 200 years, whose king Anatolia was called the father of history. The Hittite script was a phonetic alphabet derived from the Luwian script, which they encountered after conquering the Hattusa kingdom. This made the Hittites one of the first civilizations in Anatolia to have a native script. What can we apply to our lives today? First of all, we can admire their creativity and adaptability. The Hittites were not a homogeneous group of people, but rather a mix of different Indo-European tribes who came from outside Anatolia. They also interacted with many other cultures, such as the Hattian, Kassian, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian cultures. They absorbed many elements from these cultures, such as their language, religion, art, and technology. For example, they adopted the alphabet from the Luwians, the horses from the Kassites, the ironworking from the Mitannians, and the peace treaty from the Egyptians. They did not reject what was foreign. Rather, they integrated it into their own culture and made it their own. Secondly, we can learn from their achievements and contributions. The Hittites were not only survivors and imitators, but also innovators and creators. They invented many things that were new to Anatolia, such as the chariot, the iron weapon, the alphabet, the legal code, and the peace treaty. They also created many works of art and architecture that were unique and beautiful. For example, they built many open-air sanctuaries and altars where they performed religious rituals and made many sculptures and reliefs that depicted their gods, heroes, and daily life. Thirdly, we can learn from their struggles and challenges. The Hittites were not only successful and glorious, but also faced many problems and threats. They had to deal with droughts, earthquakes, famines, invasions, and rebellions. They also had to balance the interests of their various subjects and maintain the unity and stability of their empire. However, they did not give up or despair. They kept fighting for their survival and prosperity, and they left behind a legacy that inspired later civilizations. Since previously they had used cuneiform script borrowed from the Mesopotamians, they used their alphabet to record their history, laws, and treaties on tablets made of clay, stone, or metal. One of the most famous examples is the Treaty of Kadesh, which was carved on a bronze plate by Ramesses II after his battle with Muwatalli II at the Orontes River. The treaty is considered the oldest known peace treaty in history, and it shows the diplomatic skills of the Hittite king. It also provides valuable information about the Hittite and Egyptian cultures. Another famous Hittite work of art is the bronze gates of the city of Hagar, which date back to the 7th century BCE. The gates were looted by the British Museum in 1894, along with many other artifacts. The gates are decorated with intricate designs of lions, bulls, and other mythical creatures. They are examples of the Hittites' skill in metalwork and their fondness for symbolism and iconography. We will see how this empire used chariots like Greece and Rome. He expanded the empire to include Syria, northern Mesopotamia, and parts of Greece. He also reformed the religion and centralized the worship of the storm god. Suppilulium's son, Mursili II, succeeded him and continued his father's policies. However, he faced several rebellions from vassal states and had to suppress them. Mursili was killed in a chariot accident during a battle against the Kaskians. After Mursili's death, the Hittite Empire began to decline due to internal strife and external pressures. The new king, Muwatalli II, had to flee to Egypt after a rebellion by his brother and seek the help of Ramesses II to restore him on the throne. Muwatalli then launched a campaign to recover lost territories in Syria and Mesopotamia. He defeated the Egyptians at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, but it was more of a tactical draw than an outright victory. Despite this setback, Muwatalli remained friendly with Egypt and married Ramesses II's daughter as a princess. He also concluded the Treaty of Kadesh with Ramesses II, which established a peaceful border between the two empires. Muwatalli was succeeded by his son, Arnuanda II, who reigned from 1266 to 1254 BCE. During his reign, the Hittite Empire suffered from drought, famine, and earthquakes, which weakened the central authority and caused some cities to become independent. Arnuanda was forced to flee to Tabal after a usurper seized the throne, and he died in exile. The next king, Hatti III, tried to restore order and fight back the usurper. However, he was assassinated by one of his wives. The last king of the Hittite Empire was his brother, Yomezu, who ruled from 1248 to 1246 BCE. He was defeated by the Sea Peoples and other invaders who destroyed the empire and sacked the capital city of Hagia. He fled to Cilicia and died there. The Hittite language and culture disappeared after the empire's collapse, but its legacy lived on through the Neo-Hittite states and the Phrygian kingdom. Their descendants spoke the same language and followed the same religion as the Hittites, but thousands of years before them. How they had an alphabet and kept records of their kings and their deeds, and how they created some amazing works of art and architecture. Let us begin our journey to Anatolia, now modern-day Turkey. Here we meet the Hittites, who were Indo-European nomads from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. They migrated into Anatolia around 2000 BCE and encountered the indigenous people of the region, the Hattians. After a long period of struggle, the Hittites absorbed the Hattians and adopted their language. By the 17th century BCE, they had become the dominant power in Anatolia and established the first known Iron Age in Anatolia. During the Late Bronze Age, they traded extensively with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean civilizations. Their kings claimed descent from the legendary god of storms, Tarhunt. who was also worshipped by the Hattians and the Kaskians. The Hittite pantheon included many weather gods such as the Sky Father, the Earth Mother, the Storm God, the Sun and the Moon deities, as well as some minor local deities. However, the most important Hittite deity was the Storm God, who was associated with fertility, justice and war. He was also identified with the Iranian god of thunder, Ahura Mazda. This identification reflects the influence of Iranian culture on the Hittites, which may have resulted from the migration of Iranian tribes into Anatolia or from trade contacts with Iran. The Hittites also had a goddess of the underworld, who was called Alani or Mama. She was the wife of the storm god and the mother of the sun and the moon gods. She was also associated with magic and witchcraft. The Hittite religion was polytheistic and animistic, meaning that they believed in many gods and spirits that inhabited natural objects such as trees, rivers, and stones. They also believed in an afterlife where the dead went to a place called the land of the living. The Hittite religion had many similarities with other Indo-European religions, such as the Vedic religion of India and the early Greek religion. One of these similarities is the belief in a dualistic cosmology, which is the idea that the world is created from two opposing principles, one good and one evil. In Hittite mythology, the good principle is represented by the storm god and his wife, the goddess of the underworld. The evil principle is represented by a dragon or serpent, who is the enemy of the storm god. The storm god defeats the dragon and creates the world from his body. This myth is similar to the Vedic myth of Purusha, the cosmic man whose sacrifice creates the world. Another similarity between the Hittite religion and the Vedic religion is the use of animal sacrifices to honor the gods. The Hittites sacrificed horses, oxen, and sheep to propitiate the storm god and other deities. They also used divination to gain insight into the will of the gods. Divination was a common practice in ancient cultures, and the Hittites were no exception. They used various methods to predict the future, such as examining the entrails of sacrificed animals, interpreting omens, and casting lots. The Hittite language belonged to the Indo-European family and was closely related to the Vedic Sanskrit and the old Iranian languages. The Hittite civilization reached its peak during the reign of Suppiluliuma I, who ruled from 1344 to 1323 BCE. So what can we learn from the Hittites? If you want to know more about the ancient world, please subscribe. What's the first thing you think of when you hear the word Hittite? Are you thinking, well, today we are talking about the might and mystery of the ancient Hittite Empire. Women held considerable power within Hittite society, especially in the royal court. This was due to their matrilineal system, where lineage and inheritance were traced through the mother's line rather than the father's. In this system, women had a significant role in political and religious affairs. Now that we've established that the Hittites valued women more than other empires of the time, he was only a child, the daughter of King Telepenus and the wife of his successor, Arnuan. After her husband's death, the Tawananna was the highest female official in the Hittite Empire. She led religious ceremonies and festivals and offered sacrifices to the gods. It is clear from this that the Hittites viewed the relationship between the king and the Tawananni as a partnership. One of the most important aspects of the Tawananni's job was to sign treaties on behalf of the king. This was a big responsibility, but it also gave the Tawananni a lot of power. Then they must have also respected and honored the women in their empire. And the most important female official was the Tawananni, who acted as both a priestess and a diplomat. The Tawananni signed treaties on behalf of the king. What did you find most interesting about the Hittite Empire? Do you know of any other ancient empires with progressive views on gender roles? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. And her name survived for centuries as a symbol of the respect and honor she received. The Hittite Empire is a reminder that gender roles are not set in stone, and that women can hold important positions of power. Right? Well, maybe. Unfortunately, we can't know for sure what went on in the minds of those ancient rulers, but we do know that the Hittite Empire was one of the most powerful and prosperous empires of its time, and we know that the women of the empire, especially the Tawananni, played an important role in its success. When the king went to war, he would often leave the signing of treaties to the Tawananni. This was because the Tawananni was seen as a neutral party. She was not involved in the fighting, and therefore her signature carried more weight. The Tawananni would sign treaties with other kings, queens, and governors. She would also negotiate terms and conditions of the treaties. This required a great deal of skill and diplomacy, but the Tawananni was up to the task. She was a wise and experienced politician, and she knew how to get what she wanted. The king needed the Tawanana's advice and support in order to rule effectively. The Hittite Empire fell in 1178 BC, but the memory of the Tawanana lived on. The Tawanana was such an important figure in Hittite society that even after the empire fell, people still talked about her. In fact, the Tawanana's name has survived to this day. We know her name was Hepa, and you may be asking, who cares about her name? We already knew that, but Hepa's name didn't just survive on its own. It became a common name for Tawananis after her. For centuries, Hittite rulers continued to name their Tawananis Hepa in honor of the great Tawanani. This shows how important and respected Hepa was. She was a role model for all Hittite women, and they wanted their daughters and granddaughters to be just like her. And the Tawanana needed the king's power and protection in order to carry out her duties. The Tawanana and the king worked together for the good of the empire. Together, they made sure that the empire was prosperous and peaceful. The Tawanana was a vital part of the Hittite government. She was a powerful woman who had a lot of responsibility, but she also had a lot of support. The king and the rest of the government knew that she was an important part of the team, and they relied on her to do her job well. She was also responsible for interpreting the will of the gods. The Tawanana was also a political figure. She advised the king on matters related to war and diplomacy. She also represented the king at important events and meetings. The Tawanana was a very busy woman. She had to be well organized and able to multitask. She also had to be able to deal with stressful situations calmly and effectively. The Tawanana was a very important position in Hittite society. The woman who held the position had to be intelligent, resourceful, and level-headed. She was a religious figure who acted as a mediator between the gods and the king. She was also a political figure who advised the king on matters related to war and diplomacy. The Tawanani was a powerful position, but it was not hereditary. The king could choose any woman he wanted to be his Tawanana, regardless of her social status. In fact, the Tawanana could come from any level of society. The only requirement was that she had to be able to perform the duties of the office. She took control of the empire and acted as regent for her son, Hattusa III. During her regency, she successfully defended the empire from attack and kept it stable until her son was old enough to rule. Again, we don't know much about these women or the many others who served as regents for the Hittite Empire, but their roles in shaping the empire's history should not be overlooked. They were powerful, intelligent women who were able to navigate the complex world of politics and diplomacy to keep the empire strong and prosperous, leaving the running of the empire to his mother and grandmother. It is believed that Pudu Hepa played a key role in securing alliances with neighboring kingdoms and in promoting trade throughout the empire. She also oversaw the construction of several important buildings, including a palace at the city of Hattusa. Though we don't have much information about her, it's clear from what little we do know that she was a force to be reckoned with. Let's take a look at what life was like for a woman in the royal court. One of the most important things to understand is that women were not allowed to become queen regnant. Instead, they acted as regents for male rulers who were too young or otherwise unable to rule. This meant that these women were responsible for making important decisions on behalf of the kingdom, including those related to war and diplomacy. They also had the authority to appoint officials to important positions and to oversee the collection of taxes. While they did not hold the title of queen, these women were still incredibly powerful and influential. They were able to use their power to shape the future of the Hittite Empire. The queen's influence extended beyond the domestic sphere, and she could participate actively in the affairs of the kingdom. They could hold important positions in the government and even play a crucial role in diplomacy. We'll talk more about the diplomatic missions of the queen later on. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be exploring what life was like for women in the royal court of the Hittite Empire, one of the world's first great superpowers. Now, if you know anything about ancient empires, you probably already know that these types of societies were not exactly progressive. When it came to gender equality, the Hittites, however, might have surprised you with their matrilineal society and powerful women. So let's dive right in. Gendered power, the queen's voice. Let's look at some of the titles given to the queens during the reign of different kings. For example, during Mursili II's reign, his mother was referred to as Great of Praises, while his sister was called My Sister, the king's daughter. These titles show how the Hittite Empire valued and respected women, especially those in the royal family. However, it is also important to note that these titles may have been used for propaganda purposes to show the world that the Hittites were a progressive empire who treated women well. In reality, though, the Hittite Empire wasn't always so egalitarian. For instance, there was a taboo against a woman becoming queen in her own right. Even if a woman was the most qualified ruler, she would never ascend to the throne. Instead, the throne would pass to her male relatives, such as her brother or son. This rule was put into place to ensure that the bloodline of the previous king was continued. Still, it's worth noting that these restrictions only applied to commoners. As we saw earlier, royal women had much more freedom and power than their non-royal counterparts. Women in the royal court. One of the most famous examples of a powerful Hittite woman was Queen Pudu-Hepa, the wife of Mursili II, when her husband ascended to the throne. Another example is Queen Nituchia, Tawanana, not just queen, but priestess and power broker. The Tawanana's main duty was to act as a priestess. The title Tawanani means my heart's desire in Hittite. Her voice signed treaties. Her name endured. Now, here's a thought. If the Hittite rulers respected and honored the Tawanani, the Hittite Empire was a matrilineal society that valued women and gave them important roles in the government and religion. Women could become regents and advisors. Now it's time to hear from you. The Hittite Empire, Part 2. The Battle of Kadesh, a war with no winner. All right, everyone. It's time for more Hittite history. He campaigned around Lake Van, resettled some city-states, and defeated the Arzawa and Lucca Confederation in the west. At this time, the Hittites were still recovering from the previous war with the Casca, so Mursili decided to take a break from fighting after realizing that his father's enemies were regrouping. His reign is remembered by one major event, the Battle of Kadesh against Egypt. Now, according to Egyptian records, the Egyptians lost 5,000 men, but the Hittite sources say they lost only 3,000. The Hittite king wanted to personally lead the attack on the city. The Hittite army was exhausted. They had been marching non-stop and were in desperate need of rest. Just when they thought about resting, they got word that the Egyptians were returning to Kadesh with reinforcements. They had no choice but to keep marching, but his council told him not to because he needed his strength for an upcoming campaign against the Casca. In the morning, the Hittites woke up to the sound of battle. No decisive victory or defeat, no clash of titans. It was a complete mess. Both sides claimed victory and neither could prove otherwise. They marched for 4 days before they encountered an Egyptian reconnaissance force. They sent a messenger to tell them to turn back, but when the Hittites refused, Ramses led his troops to the riverbank and watched as the Hittites crossed. Once they were all across, he ordered his troops to attack. The Hittite scouts told their king that the river was full of enemy soldiers and chariots, but Mursili was not afraid. He had 3,000 chariots, which was more than enough to deal with whatever the Egyptians threw at them. The Egyptians had attacked them in the middle of the night, and now they were in full retreat. The Hittite king was forced to flee, and his army was in disarray, but he was still alive and the treaty ended the war. So I guess you could say that it was a victory for both sides. Instead, they told him to send General Mursili to finish the job. Well, the answer is simple. They were exhausted. The Hittites had been fighting for decades, and their economy was suffering because of it. Well, the peace treaty between the Hittites and the Egyptians lasted for 20 years. After that, the Egyptians broke it and started attacking the Hittites again. But that is a story for another video. Also, the Egyptians were just as strong. Even though they lost many men in battle, they still had a massive army, as the Hittite infantry fought bravely. Their chariots were no match for the Egyptian charioteers. The Treaty of Kadesh was probably the best option for them. It saved them from total destruction and allowed them to keep their kingdom intact. I want to thank everyone who supported me through the last few months. It means a lot to me. I'm trying to grow my channel and share my love of history with the world. It is known as the Treaty of Kadesh, and it is one of the most important documents from the ancient world. One by one, the Hittite chariots were destroyed until finally, neither he nor his son shall make war upon the other. Let there be peace between them forever. I will link the support page in the description below. If any one of the two kings breaks the terms of this treaty, may the God of the one who has been wronged smite him just as he smote the first king, Muwatalli, son of Bithiah. May he cut off his offspring and his posterity. Let him destroy his land and his cities, and let his name be wiped out forever. You see, the Hittite version of events says that Mursili, despite losing many chariots, was able to fight his way through the Egyptian lines and escape. He then regrouped his remaining forces and launched a counterattack. When Mursili's chariot was attacked, he fled on foot. Neither side could continue fighting, so they called for a truce. They met in the middle and agreed to end the war. But before we get to that, Let's see what else he did during his 46-year-long reign. They ran away from the battlefield, leaving behind their dead and wounded. Ramses was victorious. They weren't feeling too confident after their narrow victory at the Orontes River. So Mershili went back to Hattusa to regroup and prepare for another Egyptian offensive, only to find out that the Egyptians had left the city. As he pursued them, they engaged in battle again, and once again, the Egyptians had to retreat, leaving behind even more men. Last time we ended with the death of Suppiluliuma and the beginning of his successor's reign. Mershili too. Ramses had won his first victory against the Hittites. He came to power when the Hittites were busy with the Casca, and the rest of the Near East was busy with their own civil wars. This gave Ramses time to regroup Egypt's forces and prepare for war. And then he struck. He had defeated the Hittites twice and was preparing for a third strike. But little did he know that the Hittite king had already left for Kadesh. That episode was watched by over 100,000 people, and I hope they all enjoyed it because I had a lot of fun making it. Unfortunately for Egypt, Merneptah didn't know how strong the Hittites were and made a huge mistake. He attacked the city of Kadesh, which was protected by one of the most brilliant Hittite generals, Merciless. I am so glad that people are interested in these ancient civilizations. Now, today we are going to talk about the second king of the Old Kingdom, Mershili II. After Suppiluliuma's death, Mershili had to deal with some rebellions from some vassal states, but he put them down quickly and moved on with his campaigns. As the Hittite Empire expanded, so did their enemies list. Soon after taking the throne, Mershili had to deal with the Assyrians who attacked his northern borders. He also had problems with the sea peoples who were attacking his coastal cities, and the Egyptians were licking their chops at the prospect of hitting the Hittites while they were vulnerable. You see, Egypt had a new pharaoh, Ramesses II. He took advantage of the recent deaths of the Hittite kings and sent his general, the future pharaoh Merneptah, to attack the Hittites with 5,000 chariots. General Merciless was able to inflict heavy casualties on the Egyptians, forcing them to retreat back to the city. So the next day, Mershili and his troops advanced towards Kadesh, but this victory came at a price. And so they followed the Egyptians all the way to the Orontes River, where they pitched their camp for the night. This time, Mershili knew that if he pursued them any further, he would lose his army, so he ordered them to return to Hattu. Now, even though the Hittites won the first battle, meanwhile, Ramses was having a lot of fun. Now, let me be clear here. There was no dramatic battle. The Hittite army set out from Hattusa and advanced into Syrian territory. When the Egyptians realized that the Hittites had arrived, the fighting was fierce, but the Egyptians had the upper hand. The Hittites were completely routed, except, wait, no, the Hittites say that they won. In the end, both armies were exhausted. The peace treaty between the Hittites and the Egyptians was one of the first of its kind in history. Here's what it says. In the end, the Battle of Kadesh was not a decisive victory for either side. But why? Why would the Hittites accept a treaty with Egypt? Why didn't they keep fighting? On the other hand, the Hittites were outnumbered. So what happened next? I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I really had a lot of fun making it. In 1907, a bolt of lightning struck a mountain in the Middle East and revealed to archaeologists an entire, forgotten city. It was the first lost city of the Hittites, one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world. The discovery kicked off decades of excavations that revealed secrets about this mysterious civilization. But there is one secret they've been hiding from us. Because over 3,000 years ago, the Hittite Empire just vanished, and even today, no one knows why. The economy of the Hittite Empire was diverse and robust. The society of the Hittite Empire was hierarchical with the king at the top, followed by a nobility class, commoners and slaves. The religion of the Hittites was polytheistic with a pantheon of gods and goddesses. The chief god was called Telepinu, the storm god, who was associated with the sky and thunder. Despite its relatively short duration, the Hittite Empire left an indelible mark on history. You see, when the Hittites were at the height of their power, there was a lot going on in the ancient Near East. They were kind of mysterious, like one minute they were there and the next minute they were gone. Nobody knows exactly what happened to them. One theory is that the Egyptians were leaving behind a legacy that has fascinated scholars and adventurers for centuries. Their empire, which flourished in Anatolia, left an enduring impact on the ancient Near East. Their advancements in areas such as agriculture, architecture, and governance serve as a reminder of their ingenuity and sophistication. Unfortunately, their sudden collapse remains an enigma, shrouded in mystery and speculation. Theories abound, ranging from natural disasters to the incursions of nomadic tribes. Yet the true cause of their demise continues to elude our understanding. Nonetheless, the Hittite legacy endures through their monumental architecture, works of art, and most notably, their influence on the development of Indo-European languages. As we continue to explore the ruins of their ancient cities and decipher their enigmatic texts, the Hittites beckon us to unravel the secrets of their glorious past. Hey, we lost against the Hittites once, so let's take them down now. And they teamed up with the Assyrians and Babylonians to destroy the Hittite Empire. But another theory is that the Hittites were wiped out by a natural disaster like a volcanic eruption or something. We don't really know. It's like they vanished into thin air. Egypt was having a moment. The new kingdom was kicking butt and taking names. Even though the Hittite Empire is gone, their legacy lives on. You see, the Hittites didn't just leave behind their horses and chariots. They also left behind their language and their culture. And that stuff is still around today. So even though the Hittites aren't around anymore, we can still learn a lot from them and appreciate their contributions to the ancient world. Babylon was starting to flex its muscles and Assyria was rising to power. But then out of nowhere, the Hittites show up and they were like, "Yo, back up, guys. It's our turn to rule." The Hittites weren't just some small-time rulers. They had a massive empire that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf, and they ruled over a bunch of different people, including the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians. The Hittites were so powerful that they even fought against the Egyptians and won. Can you imagine? The Egyptians losing a battle? Yeah, it actually happened. Their innovations in areas such as agriculture, architecture, and governance influenced subsequent civilizations. The discovery of the Hittite language and their ancient texts provided valuable insights into the history of Indo-European languages. Furthermore, the Hittite legacy can be seen in the art and culture of the region. Their monumental architecture, including the remains of their cities and temples, stands as a testament to their engineering skills and cultural achievements. The Hittites were skilled craftsmen, and their works of art, including sculptures and metalwork, showcase their artistic talents. Today, the ruins of Hittite cities and archaeological finds are preserved in museums around the world, serving as reminders of this once mighty empire. Other important deities included the sun goddess and the earth goddess. The Hittites believed in a cosmic struggle between the gods and demons, with the gods eventually triumphing over the demons. The Hittites kept stables full of these bad boys, and they used them to ride into battle and pull their chariots. They were basically the ancient equivalent of having a jet fighter and a team of attack helicopters, all in one. With their horses, the Hittites could zoom around the battlefield and take down anyone who got in their way. It's no wonder they were such a powerful empire. This belief is reflected in their art and architecture, which often depicts scenes of battles between the forces of good and evil. Religious rituals and festivals were an integral part of Hittite culture and were celebrated throughout the empire. These events not only had a spiritual significance, but also served as a way to bring the community together. The Hittites built impressive temples and shrines to honor their gods. One notable example is the temple of the sun goddess at Samsu, which was a major religious center in the empire. The king held both religious and political power, and was considered the representative of the gods on earth. The nobility class consisted of landowners, officials, and members of the royal court. Commoners included farmers, artisans, and merchants, while slaves were typically captives of war or people who had fallen into debt. Hittite society was patriarchal, with men holding more rights and responsibilities than women. However, women could own property and participate in religious ceremonies. Family was an important aspect of Hittite society, and the extended family played a significant role in social and economic life. Agriculture was a significant part of their economic activity, with fertile lands in Anatolia producing crops such as wheat, barley, and vegetables. They also raised livestock including cattle, sheep, and goats. But for all their advances, the Hittite Empire collapsed in the early 8th century BC, and when it did, it took its secrets with it. The sudden disappearance of the Hittite Empire has puzzled historians and archaeologists for centuries. Several theories have been proposed to explain this enigmatic collapse. Natural disasters. One of the most compelling theories is that natural disasters such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or a change in climate may have contributed to the downfall of the Hittite Empire. Earthquakes are common in the region where the Hittites lived, and a major earthquake could have devastated the empire, disrupting its political and economic stability. Another theory blames it on the Kaska people. The Kaska were an Indo-European tribe that lived in the mountains of northern Anatolia. They were known to be fierce warriors and had been in conflict with the Hittites for centuries. Eventually, the Casca expanded their territory and may have played a role in the decline of the Hittite Empire. But the most widely accepted theory is the theory of the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples were a group of raiders who came from the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean coast. They attacked coastal cities and disrupted trade routes throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples' attacks may have weakened the Hittite Empire, contributing to its ultimate collapse. But despite these theories, the exact cause of the Hittite Empire's collapse remains a mystery. The Hittites were skilled metal workers and produced high-quality iron tools and weapons, which gave them a technological edge over their enemies. Trade played a vital role in the Hittite economy as they had established extensive networks that extended to the Mediterranean coast and Mesopotamia. Through trade, they acquired luxury goods such as ivory and exotic spices, which were highly valued in their society. In today's video, we will tell you all about the Hittite Empire. Let's get started. Origins. The Hittites were an Indo-European people who migrated to Anatolia around the 20th century BC. They quickly grew into the powerful Hittite Empire, which at its peak stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf, encompassing much of modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and parts of Iran. The empire lasted for several centuries, leaving behind a rich legacy of art, architecture, and literature. The Hittite language is one of the oldest known languages, and it helped scholars better understand the evolution of language over time. Their political system was highly advanced for its time, with a king at the head of the empire and a sophisticated bureaucracy to manage its vast territories. They developed a unique legal code which emphasized justice and equality under the law. In fact, the Hittites were one of the first empires to have a written constitution, laying the groundwork for future civilizations to come. Economy. Society. Religion. Collapse. Legacy. What's interesting about the Hittites is that they had a big impact on the world even though they were gone so soon. But what makes the Hittites even cooler is that they were obsessed with horses. They loved those horses more than anything. Now here's the thing about the Hittites. But here's the thing. The Hittites were truly a remarkable civilization. The Hittite Empire is one of the most important topics in history. It is just a shame no one knows anything about it, because that would mean talking about one of the most screwed up empires to ever exist. They didn't show up in the Bible or appear in Greek literature, and all their contemporaries seem to forget that they even existed. So you can forgive us if we got a little confused. A British soldier named Hugh H. Rawlinson set aside his time between fighting wars in India to study Hittite. He used Rawlinson's research to further crack the Hittite language, and then he got to work translating their texts. At first, he would only get brief glimpses of meaning in the Hittite script. Soldiers wearing terrifying lion skins would storm into battle astride chariots, pulled by teams of swift horses. They wore armor made of leather and bronze. Every king thought he had to go out and conquer new lands. So instead of passing on a stable empire to the next guy, they would pass on a war that needed finishing. They worshipped a pantheon of gods, including a weather god named Tarhunt, a fertility goddess named Hannah, and an underworld deity named Aluyankas. The locals actually practiced polytheism well before it was trendy, and those deities often showed up in their art. They created a lasting impact on the nations around them and left behind a trove of myths that have resonated with people for millennia. But most importantly, they prove that just because an empire is forgotten doesn't mean it's gone forever. With a little ingenuity and a lot of perseverance, we can bring the dead empires back to life. All we need to do is look around us. Their creations are everywhere. We found countless works of Hittite art, including sculptures, reliefs, and seals. The main theme in their art was hunting. Managed to leave behind a legacy that has inspired the world for thousands of years. If they can do it, so can you. They carved images of kings and gods taking down wild animals, usually with the help of their trusty chariots. But they also took inspiration from mythology. Hi, it's me. And remember, if you want to learn more about any of the topics we discuss, there's a link in the description to a great book or documentary. Also, a huge shout out to our supporters. We couldn't have made this video without your support. Some of the statues depicted scenes from their creation story, while others retold the legend of the almond tree, which explains how humanity came to be. And this happened over and over and over again until every nation in the region. It comes from a text called the Tale of the Great Flood. And the story is almost identical to the story of Noah's Ark. The main character is a man named Atnapishtim, who receives a message from the gods that the world will be destroyed by a great flood. So he builds a boat and takes all the animals aboard. Then the rain falls for 7 days and 7 nights, and Utnapishtim releases a dove to see if the waters have receded. When the bird returns with an olive leaf in its mouth, he knows that it's time to disembark. In short, the Hittites had their own book of Genesis, and unfortunately for them, they weren't done retelling the story, was tired of the Hittite shenanigans and decided to band together and wipe them off the map. Scholars point to a collection of 65 poems known as the Song of Ulakumni as the earliest example of an epic. It tells the story of a young hero named Ulakumni and his journey to overthrow the gods. The poems were written down on clay tablets and then recited aloud. Back then, the internet was hot, fresh gossip, and by all accounts, the Hittites were experts at the art of storytelling. They had bards traveling all over the empire, keeping the myths alive and kicking. Even though the Hittite Empire only lasted a few hundred years, their stories have lasted for thousands. Unfortunately for the Hittites, their final enemy was nature itself. A series of volcanic eruptions plunged the world into darkness and caused the entire civilization to collapse. Crops failed, famine struck, and the empire fell apart. Helmets with horse tails sticking out of them and carried weapons like spears, swords, and axes. And the soldiers weren't even the scariest part. Their biggest advantage was the chariot, a vehicle that hadn't yet been invented by anyone else in the region. They were fast, deadly, and completely unexpected, which made them devastating in battle. In fact, Hittite chariots are considered by many to be the greatest innovation in warfare during the Bronze Age. Most historians agree that without the Hittite Empire, the Egyptians would have never become a superpower. A word here, a phrase there, sometimes just a single word. But he kept pushing forward, determined to unlock the secrets of this mysterious empire. Finally, on April 18, 1907, he saw it, the first deciphered Hittite inscription, a proper sentence translated into English. The Hittites lost their kingdom and melted away into obscurity. But after thousands of years, they're back, and we have the internet to thank for it. A French researcher named Pierre de Mirascheggi discovered that by putting the word Hittite into Google Translate, and then inputting the results into an AI program, you could make surprisingly accurate translations from Hittite to English. Basically, the algorithm had learned to translate Hittite all on its own, and that opened up a whole new world for researchers. Now they could upload hundreds of Hittite texts to the program and get immediate translations. It was a breakthrough moment, and it gave us insight into one of the most interesting lost empires in history. The sun god bless my steps. It wasn't much, but it was the start of something big. Over the next few days, he translated more and more Hittite, learning about their religious beliefs, social customs, treaties with other empires, and, most importantly, their name, the Kingdom of Hatti. He wanted to understand their writing, but he only had a handful of scraps to work with very little material to go off of. He made slow progress until he noticed something strange. One of the tablets he was looking at contained both Hittite and another language, Akkadian, which was used throughout the Near East at the time. By comparing the two scripts, he was able to make some educated guesses as to what the Hittite symbols stood for. He started getting somewhere, but he wouldn't live long enough to see his hard work pay off. He died in 1882 before he could finish translating. When we found their massive capital city in modern Turkey with dozens of their big stone temples lying around, we didn't have any reason to believe that such a place could have been home to a real civilization, a vast empire spanning from the Middle East to modern Turkey and northern Syria. But why did we never hear about them? Well, it turns out they did make an appearance in Egyptian records, and we actually have them to thank for the pyramids. See, the Egyptians weren't crazy for building giant pyramids. They were actually forced to by the Hittites. After a decade of war, the Egyptians made a treaty with the Hittites, agreeing to stop attacking each other and swap hostages. One of the hostages was an Egyptian architect named Hattusa. He learned how to build the pyramids from the Egyptians, brought the knowledge back to Hattu, and suddenly everyone was building pyramids. We don't know why exactly the Egyptians agreed to this treaty. Maybe they were tired of fighting, or maybe they didn't want to deal with the Hittite military. Because if there's one thing we learned about the Hittites, it's that they had one hell of a military. In fact, the locals believed it to be the mythical city of Troy, and scholars agreed, chalking up its ruins to a minor Bronze Age city which might have inspired Homer's epic poem. But as time went on, we realized that there was too much going on here to write it off as a small town. There were too many palaces, too many temples, and too many statues of bulls. Not that there's anything wrong with having a lot of bull statues, but they didn't fit the bill for Troy, and that meant we needed to figure out who they belonged to. You know, it was huge, influential, and had a military so big it put Rome to shame. For one thing, we didn't even know what language they spoke. We couldn't read any of their inscriptions, so we had no way of knowing who lived there, let alone understanding what went on in their society. In other words, we knew we had stumbled upon the greatest lost city in the world, but we didn't know anything about it. Imagine being the first person to discover Cleopatra's tomb and not being able to read the hieroglyphs on the wall. That's how frustrating this must have been, and yet there's barely a Wikipedia page for it. How did this happen? How can one of the most impressive empires in ancient history be forgotten? Well, like a lot of things in the late ancient world, it boils down to two letters, N-P-O, and also the fact that they were wiped off the face of the earth by a series of volcanic eruptions. For over 200 years, we thought the Hittites were nothing more than a myth. Unfortunately, that wasn't very easy, but eventually someone stepped up to take on the challenge of deciphering the Hittite language, and it fell to his friend, a German archaeologist named Bedřich Hrozný, to complete the task. It turned out that these guys were major players in the Near East. Their army was so legendary that the Egyptians described them as divine. Now, despite their impressive military, the Hittites had a fatal flaw. They loved making enemies, and that should have been the end of it, the end of the story. We learned about their religion, which was a bit of a hodgepodge of local Anatolian religions mixed with Mesopotamian cults. Speaking of myths, the Hittite Empire was also responsible for the oldest known version of the flood narrative. You see, the Hittite Empire was a hotbed of storytelling. It might have been the birthplace of epic poetry. The Hittites might have vanished from history, but they left behind a rich legacy of poetry, sculpture, and politics. So the next time you're feeling uninspired, just remember the Hittites, a bunch of random soldiers, priests, and farmers from a tiny corner of the world. Thank you. And now we come to the end. The fires in the hearth have gone low. The scribes have closed their styluses. The stone gates of Hattusa, once echoing with footsteps and commands, stand quiet in the moonlight. The Hittite Empire is no more. It didn't fall all at once. There was no final war carved in legend, no dramatic last king on a battlefield. Instead, there was absence. The tablets stopped. The messengers no longer came. The offerings to the gods were left unanswered, and the hills, once full of voices, returned to silence. No one knew why, and for over 3,000 years, no one remembered who. But silence is not the same as forgetting. Beneath layers of soil and ash, the empire waited, its memory tucked into clay, unread, unbroken, until the right hands and the right questions came to listen. And now, those voices rise again, in whispers, in fragments, in soft syllables etched by stylus long ago. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, and your breath grows slow, let your thoughts settle on the quiet places of the world. The empire's no longer seen. The language is almost lost. The names that faded not because they failed, but because they were buried under too much time. And let that remind you that even silence holds stories. Sleep now. Let the gates of Hattusa close behind you. Let the stone lions return to stillness. Let the memory of the Hittites drift like mist over the Anatolian plains. They are gone, but they are not forgotten. Good night.